February 23, 1944, twilight in the rain-swept valley of the Rapido River. Below, the mud, the shattered olive groves, and the rusting, jagged scrap metal that marks where ambition met absolute resistance. Above, dominating the entire world that mattered to the Allied advance in Italy, stood the great Massif of Monte Cassino. It was not merely a hill. It was the hinge of the entire German defensive strategy, the linchpin of the Winter Line, and the graveyard of thousands of Allied hopes. To look upon Cassino was to understand immediately why the Italian campaign had stalled into a catastrophic slow-motion siege. The mountain rises almost 2,000 feet straight out of the Liri Valley floor, a massive, jagged wedge of rock that controls the convergence of the primary roads leading toward Rome. At its apex, carved into the bedrock and dominating the skyline for miles, was the ancient revered sanctuary of the Benedictine Monastery of St. Benedict. The Germans, masters of defense, had understood the genius of the terrain instantly. They had designated this sector the Gustav Line, and they had engineered it with cold, deliberate brilliance. Though they initially claimed the ancient monastery itself was unoccupied, the entire surrounding height was saturated with the most dedicated German troops, the formidable paratroopers, the Fallschirmjäger. Their positions were not hastily dug trenches. They were concrete bunkers, machine gun nests carved directly into the unforgiving stone, and interlocking fields of fire that covered every possible approach. The Allies were trapped in a funnel of death. Any attempt to cross the Rapido River into the Liri Valley, the necessary route to bypass the mountains and head north, was met with artillery and small arms fire directed from the heights, a constant, demoralizing rain of accurate death. The Germans held the high ground. They observed everything. They controlled the tempo and direction of the battle. The Allies were fighting gravity, history, and a perfectly constructed defense simultaneously. For 3 agonizing months, the effort to crack this impossible fortress had consumed the Allied Fifth Army, turning the picturesque Italian landscape into a landscape of biblical suffering. The first battle, in mid-January, saw American troops of the 36th Infantry Division attempt the costly crossing of the icy Rapido River, resulting in a massacre that cost nearly 2,000 men for absolutely zero strategic gain. They were drowned, shredded, or pinned down in the exposed fields. The second attempt focused on a flanking maneuver, and an assault on the nearby peak of Monte Cassino saw French and Moroccan mountain troops achieve incredible feats of vertical climbing, only to be ground down by counterattacks. Fighting in a desolate frozen wilderness of rock, the third attempt was the most notorious. Frustrated by the incessant casualties and convinced that the monastery itself, whether occupied or not, was providing the German defenders with crucial observation posts, Allied command made the terrible, controversial decision to bomb the historic structure to rubble. On February 15th, hundreds of tons of high explosives reduced the 700-year-old sanctuary to dust and jagged stone. The result was tactically negligible, but morally devastating. The bombing not only failed to dislodge the German defenders, but the subsequent assault by Indian and New Zealand troops attempting to climb the ridge found the pulverized stone and concrete rubble offered the German paratroopers even better, safer firing positions and deeper defensive cover. They merely moved into the ruins and continued the slaughter. By the end of the third battle in late February, the Allied forces were exhausted, shattered, and psychologically broken. Thousands had been killed, thousands more wounded, and morale was perilously low. The Liri Valley was strewn with abandoned tanks, broken equipment, and the unburied dead. Command realized that the hammer blows delivered by the Americans, the French, the Indians, and the New Zealanders had only hardened the German resolve. Cassino had become the defining symbol of Allied failure in Italy, a magnificent, malevolent bastion that seemed truly unstoppable. The stalemate had to be broken, and quickly. General Sir Harold Alexander, commanding the Allied armies in Italy, authorized the planning for a massive, decisive fourth offensive, codenamed Operation Diadem. This would be a colossal reshaping of forces, a commitment of resources that dwarfed the preceding attempts. Troops were pulled from different sectors, reorganized, and prepared for a final apocalyptic engagement. Among the replacements moving quietly into the lines during the final preparatory phase of April 1944 were soldiers with a unique burden of expectation and a profound desire for validation. These were men who wore a distinctive patch, soldiers exiled from their homeland, fighting for a country they might never see again. They were the Polish II Corps, commanded by General Władysław Anders. They were assigned the very worst ground, the key approaches to Monte Cassino itself. The peaks known as Point 593 and Phantom Ridge, positions that had been deemed impossible to hold, let alone capture. For these men, many of whom had fought the Soviets, escaped through Persia, and marched across continents, this mountain was not just a strategic objective. It was a chance to prove that Poland was still fighting, still capable, and still deserving of its place among the free nations of the world. The impossible task awaited them, inherited from the defeats of their comrades, forcing them to succeed where the world's greatest armies had failed, against the backdrop of the most formidable fortress ever constructed on European soil. They carried the history of their exiled nation up that bloody, defiant slope. July 30th, 1943. The harsh, dusty training grounds near Mosul, Iraq, were a world away from the frozen desolation that had forged the soldiers of the Polish Second Corps. For these men, the road to Monte Cassino did not begin in North Africa or Scotland. It began in the Soviet Union's vast, merciless interior. Their shared history was not military glory, but shared suffering. They were the remnant of a nation twice conquered in 1939, first by Hitler's panzers and then by Stalin's Red Army. When the Soviet divisions met their Polish counterparts on the eastern marches of Poland, the officers and soldiers were captured not as prisoners of war to be repatriated, but as enemies of the state, destined for the Gulag. For nearly 2 years, the foundation of the future Polish II Corps endured a hell unimaginable to their Western allies. Shipped in cattle cars across thousands of miles, they were starved and frozen in the labor camps of Siberia and Kazakhstan. They chopped trees, mined coal, and died quietly of typhus and exhaustion, their very existence erased by the totalitarian machine. The fate of their comrades, the thousands of officers who vanished without a trace, later revealed to have been executed at Katyn and elsewhere, haunted every waking moment. The survivors lived under the crushing weight of hopelessness, truly believing their nation was extinguished and their sacrifice forgotten. The shift came with the sudden, terrifying necessity of alliance. When Hitler betrayed Stalin in June 1941, Britain needed Moscow, and Moscow needed breathing room. Under pressure, Stalin agreed to an amnesty for Polish citizens, held captive the Sikorsky-Maysky Agreement. This was not a swift, orderly release, it was a desperate scramble for life. From the icy grip of the Arctic camps, half-dead soldiers and tens of thousands of civilians, including women and children, began a ragged, agonizing migration south across Central Asia. They traveled by foot, rail, and any means possible through famine and disease-ridden landscapes, heading toward the promised refuge of Persia, driven by the spectral figure of General Władysław Anders, himself recently released from the Lubyanka prison. This army, dubbed Anders's Army, was unique in the history of warfare. It was not an army of volunteers or conscripts, but an army of refugees, carrying the wounds of the Gulag, the memory of the dead, and the trauma of lost nationhood. When they finally crossed into Persia in 1942, saved by the generosity of the Shah and the logistics of the British, they brought with them the proof of Soviet cruelty. They had survived, but their survival was inextricably linked to their new mission: to fight. The Second Corps was forged in the fire of disillusionment. Unlike the free soldiers of Britain or America, these Poles knew precisely who their enemies were, and they knew the insidious danger posed by their precarious geopolitical position. as they trained in the deserts of the Middle East, preparing to join the Allied thrust into Italy. Whispers from Tehran and Moscow confirmed their fears. Their homeland was being carved up, and Western dependence on Stalin was threatening to seal Poland's fate. Their motivation was therefore intensely spiritual and deeply political. They were fighting not merely to defeat Hitler, but to earn the right to exist, to prove Poland's vital importance in the coalition, by sacrificing more than any other nation. As they could not save Poland politically through diplomatic appeals, they would save it morally through insurmountable military heroism. They would make their blood payment so large that the world could not morally dismiss them at the peace table. Monte Cassino, that impregnable rock, became the perfect crucible for this vengeance and vindication. It was the stage set for an impossible demonstration. When they arrived in Italy, inheriting the stalemate and the defeats of the prior assaults, they did so with the conviction that this was their final, desperate lottery. If they succeeded, they might force the hand of history. If they failed, they would perish, knowing that they had fought to the last breath for a home already being smothered by a new tyranny. They carried up the slopes of the Abbey not only their weapons and packs, but the entire weight of their recent history, the frozen corpses left behind in the taiga, the empty plates of the forced labor camps, the silenced voices of Katyn. Every shell fired, every meter gained was a direct refutation of the Soviet narrative that sought to erase them. The red and white flag they hoisted on the ruins of the monastery, after 4 brutal days of unrelenting close-quarters combat, was a statement written in the blood of their 2,000 dead and wounded. They had achieved the impossible, vindicating their exile and validating their sacrifice. Yet, even as the news of the victory echoed across the globe, the political reality did not shift by the time the war concluded. And despite their extraordinary contribution to the Allied victory in Italy, the great powers meeting at Yalta cemented the division of Europe, handing Poland over to Soviet domination. The soldiers of the TX Corps, these heroes of Monte Cassino, became the ultimate tragic victors. They had won the war for freedom abroad, only to realize they had lost their homeland forever. The liberation they fought for was not the one their country received. Their legacy became the enduring testimony of those who fight for the soul of a nation, even when the nation itself is already lost, holding on to the dignity of their sacrifice, long after the politicians have sold the peace. January 17, 1944, on the rain-swept slopes overlooking the Liri Valley, the sheer geometric brutality of the Gustav Line was first truly encountered by the Allied armies. The ultimate tragedy of the Polish victory lay in the undeniable fact that they were required to perform a feat of arms so costly and strategically difficult that every other powerful nation had already been broken upon its implementation. Understanding the Polish sacrifice requires first understanding the strategic nightmare that was the German defensive system anchored on Monte Cassino. The Gustav Line was not merely a series of trenches. It was an integrated defense in-depth system running across the narrowest part of Italy, utilizing the Apennine Mountains as an insurmountable shield. The terrain itself was the primary enemy, a geologic fortress stretching from the Tyrrhenian Sea in the west to the Adriatic in the east. At the center lay the Cassino Massif grouping of peaks dominated by the 700-meter height of Mount Cairo and, slightly lower but strategically pivotal, Monastery Hill, crowned by the ancient Benedictine Abbey. The Germans, masters of defensive engineering and utilizing the slave labor of local Italians, had spent months preparing this crucible. They dug deep into the rock, creating mutually supporting concrete bunkers and fighting positions that defied conventional artillery. Every approach route, every potential flanking path, every stream crossing was pre-registered for heavy mortar and artillery fire. The interlocking fields of fire meant that any unit attempting an advance would find themselves caught in a terrifying crossfire, unable to maneuver or find cover against the ceaseless barrage originating from invisible emplacements. The first attempts, starting in January 1944, illustrated the horrific effectiveness of this design. The U.S. Fifth Army, unfamiliar with the extreme difficulties of winter mountain warfare, launched frontal assaults that immediately stalled. The weather driving rain, freezing mud, and thick fog ground mechanized movement to a halt, turning the narrow mule tracks into deadly exposed corridors. Units were isolated. Supplies could not be brought forward, and the sheer physicality of climbing steep, exposed scree slopes under constant shellfire proved demoralizing and ultimately devastating. The initial failures were rooted in two fatal miscalculations: underestimating the strength of the natural fortifications and misjudging the German resolve to hold the hinge of their defensive chain. The attacks launched in February and March, primarily by British, Indian, and New Zealand forces, focused intensely on the town of Cassino and the monastery itself. The controversial bombing of the abbey in mid-February, intended to clear the way, instead created a colossal, ready-made rubble field that paradoxically provided the German Fallschirmjäger, paratroopers, with even more robust, defensible fighting positions within the ruins. The subsequent urban fighting in Cassino Town was a house-by-house slaughter, a close-quarters hell where Allied tanks were useless and infantry became trapped in sewers, basements, and the collapsed masonry. The New Zealand Corps, advancing across the flooded Rapido and Leary rivers, fought with immense bravery, but they simply could not dislodge the deeply entrenched paratroopers from the ruins of the town or the commanding heights above. The ground gained was always temporary, subject to immediate and brutal counterattack. By April 1944, the Allies had launched 3 massive offensives, each involving tens of thousands of troops, thousands of casualties, and an immense consumption of materie, and the Gustav Line had held firm. The strategic implication was clear. Direct frontal assault was suicidal, and maneuver was impossible given the observation advantage held by the Germans from their elevated positions. They could see every move, every supply run, every troop concentration for miles around. When the final battle, Operation Diadem, was conceived, the strategic planners knew they needed fresh, highly motivated troops to tackle the sectors that had already proven to be the graveyards of the American and British divisions. The assignment given to the Polish Second Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Władysław Anders, was arguably the most forbidding section of the entire line, the northern Massif, including the slopes of Mount Cairo and the nightmarish configuration of defensive positions known by the Allied troops as the Phantom Ridge. This sector was high, devoid of cover, and laced with minefields that had not been breached by any previous attacks. It was deemed unassailable by Allied commanders, the place where tactical failure was assumed before the attack even began. It was a calculated risk born of desperation, handing the impossible task to an exiled army that possessed perhaps the only necessary qualities left: extreme motivation rooted in profound political and patriotic duty, and a grim expertise in fighting in conditions where terrain was the defining enemy. The failure of previous attacks had been a tactical failure born of strategic geometry. The mountain dictated the terms of the fight, and the Germans exploited that geometry perfectly. For the Polish forces, success would not merely be a matter of courage or firepower, it would require an almost inhuman ability to overcome geology itself, to fight uphill against fixed positions where every meter gain was paid for not in sweat, but in the deepest sacrifice, vindicating not just their military capability, but the very right of their exiled nation to be taken seriously among the victorious powers. They faced the legacy of failure and transformed it into a legacy of unparalleled endurance, securing a victory that echoed through the halls of military history as the definitive testament to what a determined soldier, fighting for something beyond immediate gain, could achieve against the seemingly unassailable strongholds of human conflict. March 25, 1944, late evening at Allied Fifth Army headquarters near Venafro. The mood was less one of strategic confidence and more one of tactical desperation. For 4 agonizing months, the Allies had battered themselves against the seemingly unbreakable German defenses of the Gustav Line, culminating in the massive, failed assaults on the mountain fortress of Monte Cassino. General Sir Harold Alexander and Lieutenant General Mark Clark knew they needed a new approach, and perhaps a new sacrificial lamb. When General Władysław Anders, commander of the Polish II Corps, was summoned, he understood the gravity of the implied question before it was even formally posed. The mission presented to Anders was the capture of the Monastery Hill, the granite bastion that overlooked the entire Leary Valley. British, American, Indian, and New Zealander troops had all been bled dry on those slopes. It was, militarily, an impossible task based on precedent. Politically, however, it was a profound and deadly challenge to the exiled Polish government. The Allies, particularly the British, needed a victory here, but they also recognized the unique psychological resilience of the Polish soldiers' men who had traveled thousands of miles from Soviet labor camps through Persia and the Middle East. Fueled by a searing hatred for the Axis and a singular dream of returning to a free homeland, Anders accepted the mandate instantly, without visible hesitation. He viewed it not as a military favor, but as the inevitable and necessary blood price for Polish sovereignty. If the Polish, the Second Corps, could succeed where others had failed, the sacrifice would be undeniable, cementing their political importance and vindicating their nationhood in the eyes of the major Allied powers. Failure, he knew, would mean Poland's voice would be silenced, drowned out by the rising tide of Soviet influence and the approaching diplomatic agreements that would reshape Europe. His soldiers were not just fighting for Italy, they were fighting for the diplomatic table, fighting for Warsaw, and fighting against the growing shadow of the upcoming Yalta Conference. The solemn pre-battle planning began immediately, steeped in the bitter knowledge of what awaited them. Anders gathered his commander's men like General Michał Karasiewicz Tokarczewski and General Zygmunt Stiszko-Bohusin. Makeshift headquarters carved into the rugged landscape. Maps were spread out, marked with the indelible scars of previous assaults. The planners knew the ground intimately. Every German trench, every nested machine gun position, every millimeter of rock was analyzed. The mountain was not just a defensive position. It was a sophisticated, multi-layered death trap, built by the finest German engineers, manned by elite paratroopers, and protected by the natural, sheer brutality of the terrain. The Polish engineers and artillery officers worked feverishly, but the mathematics of assault remained grim. The initial plan required traversing open ground under direct observation from the monastery, followed by brutal uphill close-quarters fighting against deferrers who held the ultimate advantage of elevation. Casualty projections were terrifyingly high. Yet, unlike some Allied commands that had previously hesitated due to predicted losses, the Polish command accepted the calculus with a chilling resolve. These men had already paid the ultimate price. They had lost their homes, their families were scattered, and many had endured the starvation and oppression of the Soviet gulags before being released to fight. This emotional weight was the true engine of the Toink Corps. The soldiers preparing for the assault carried not just rifles and ammunition, but the collective memory of exile, deportation, and the 1939 defeat. They saw Cassino not as a nameless Italian hill, but as the proving ground where they could finally settle a decade-long blood debt. They were the physical embodiment of the free Polish state, and their mandate was simple: prove that the Polish heart could endure the unbearable, and prove that Poland's deserved to exist. In the days leading up to the May offensive, the atmosphere in the Polish lines was unique, a strange mix of profound grief and fiercely channeled religious fervor. Chaplains moved among the battalions, administering final sacraments. The Polish national anthem, the Dąbrowski's Mazurka, echoed through the camps, its lyrics detailing the need for return and the necessity of sacrifice. Every soldier understood the stakes were existential. They were exchanging their lives for a voice on the world stage, making an irreversible investment in the political future of their unborn grandchildren. Anders, personally visiting the regiments, did not offer hollow promises of swift victory. Instead, he reminded them of their duty to the nation they could not reach, emphasizing that the honor of their sacrifice would be the single greatest weapon Poland possessed in the looming post-war negotiations. He asked them to look at the towering rock, the final obstacle between them and the vindication of their shared suffering. This battle would define them. It was a testament written in advance, signed in anticipation of overwhelming sacrifice, a promise that the men who had been forgotten in the wastes of Siberia would ultimately be remembered on the ramparts of history. The Polish mandate was ultimately about visibility. Their success, achieved through unimaginable tenacity, forced the Allies to recognize their military competence, forcing the world to acknowledge that the Polish claim for freedom was sealed by the blood of their finest sons. The sacrifice at Cassino became the most potent currency of the exiled government, a profound and tragic validation that, despite all political betrayals and geographical displacement, the Polish spirit, forged in the fires of deepest suffering, remained fundamentally uncrucible. May 11, 1944, 11 p.m., across the valley of the Rapido River. The culmination of that uncrushable spirit prepared for its final, horrific test. For weeks, the Corps, under General Władysław Anders, had meticulously planned its assault, knowing that failure meant not only military defeat, but the immediate collapse of their political standing in the eyes of the Allies. Their sector was arguably the most desolate and difficult in the entire Fifth Army front, assaulting the sheer northern faces of the Cassino Massif, aiming for the high, rocky, and utterly exposed positions known as Phantom Ridge and Mount Massif. The men knew their history. They were the exiled sons of a betrayed nation, and this ground was to be the signature on their petition for freedom. At 11 p.m., the atmosphere was one of suffocating silence, punctuated only by the distant, nervous clatter of gear. Then, precisely 30 minutes later, the world, Ed. Operation Diadem began with the largest concentration of Allied artillery ever assembled in the Italian campaign. Over 1,600 guns opened fire simultaneously, unleashing a continuous, earth-shattering scream that lasted for 40 minutes. The roar was so intense it ruptured eardrums and turned the night into a searing, continuous flash of artificial lightning. The mountainside, which had stood immutable for millennia, was pulverized, choked in smoke, dust, and the acrid smell of high explosives. This acoustic terror was designed not just to destroy German positions, but to shatter the will of the defers. But the German will, especially that of the veteran 1st Parachute Division, was forged in equally hard fire. They were elite troops, masters of defensive warfare, positioned deep within reinforced bunkers, and utilizing the intricate system of caves and natural rock crevices perfected over months. While the artillery tore the trees and surface defenses apart, the core strongpoints often remained intact. As midnight approached, the ground assault commenced. The Polish Tetine Corps moved forward across the difficult, broken ground of the river valley, heading straight toward the initial, heavily mined approaches of Mount Massif and Albaneta Farm. The Carpathian Rifle Division led the initial thrust toward the most formidable height, while the Krsala Division advanced on the center right. The moment the infantry crossed their lines of departure, German defensive fire erupted with astonishing ferocity and precision. The barrage had silenced many guns, but the Fallschirmjäger had prepared their counter-fire zones meticulously. Heavy machine guns, mortars, and pre-sighted artillery rained down on the advancing columns. The primary difficulty for the Polish forces was not just the enemy, but the terrain itself. Steep, covered in razor-sharp scree and littered with hastily laid Teller mines and S-mines, bouncing Bettys, which the shelling had often failed to detonate. The darkness, initially a shield, became a labyrinth. Communication broke down immediately as radio sets were damaged or signals were lost in the shell-pocked terrain. Units, struggling to maintain cohesion on the near-vertical slopes, began to fragment under the relentless German crossfire. Men would slip and fall into bomb craters, only to be killed by incoming mortar rounds designed to target the craters themselves. The objective of the first wave was to seize the preliminary slopes and establish a foothold, easing the passage for the follow-on divisions. Yet, the initial casualties mounted almost instantly to catastrophic levels. Within the first hour, companies were reduced to platoon strength. The fighting became a series of small, isolated skirmishes, hand-to-hand combat waged inside half-destroyed bunkers and machine gun nests that were miraculously still operational. One platoon of the 3rd Carpathian Rifle Division, tasked with clearing a heavily fortified approach to a ridge known only as the Dog's Head, found themselves virtually surrounded. They battled through the dark, using bayonets and grenades to silence German positions one by one, only to discover that the main line of German defense lay further back, utterly untouched by their efforts. The German paratroopers fought with fanatical determination, refusing to yield ground even when outnumbered, knowing that every minute they held increased the overall chances of stopping the entire offensive. By the first slivers of pre-dawn light on May 12th, the cost of the initial contact was clear. The Polish Stubborn Corps had suffered hundreds of casualties, yet the key objectives, Mount Massif and Albaneta Farm, remained firmly in German hands. The offensive had stalled almost before it began. General Anders, receiving reports that painted a grim picture of disorganization and heavy losses, faced an agonizing decision. Should he commit reserve divisions to sustain an attack that seemed doomed to fail in its opening stage, or should he pause, reorganize under murderous fire, and wait for daylight? The political imperative drove the military decision. To stop now is to confirm the Allied suspicion that the Poles were incapable of executing a decisive frontal assault. The price of their national vindication, they now realized, would be paid on these unforgiving slopes in the bloodiest possible currency. Though their initial gains were minimal, the essential effect was achieved. The elite German 1st Parachute Division was now fully engaged and pinned down by the relentless suicidal pressure of the exiled Polish soldiers. This sacrifice, though seemingly futile in its first hours, committed the best of the German defensive forces to the northern sector, allowing the wider Allied attacks further south supported by American and French forces to achieve the crucial breakthroughs that would ultimately doom the Cassino Line. The opening night was thus not a military victory, but a necessary, tragic immolation, a declaration in lives that the Poles would not yield until they had fulfilled their dreadful contract with history. May 12, 1944, dawn broke over the Liri Valley, illuminating the true price of that terrible opening night. The slopes below Monte Cassino, which the Polish Thou Corps had attacked with such desperate fury, were now a landscape of carnage, a mosaic of broken rock and human despair. The objective of Hill 59 the ultimate gatekeeper to the monastery, remained defiant in German hands. Though the first assault had failed to secure the main heights, it had cost the Poles nearly 3,000 casualties in 12 hours, forcing the Wehrmacht's elite 1st Parachute Division into a defensive battle of pure exhaustion. The main battle was shifting now from the immediate shock of the assault to the sustained, brutal engagement necessary to pry the German grip from the mountain's secondary objectives. These objectives were defined by two names that would forever stain the memory of the Polish forces: Phantom's Ridge and the Albaneta Farm. Phantom's Ridge was the most exposed stretch of ground on the entire Cassino front. It was not a grand geographical feature, but a knife edge of rock bare, devoid of cover, and running directly into the converging fire of German positions on Hill 59 and the equally formidable Hill 575. To approach it was to enter a cauldron of concentrated machine gun fire and predetermined artillery coordinates. The Germans had sighted every yard of that rock face, turning it into an industrial killing zone. The men of the 6th Wow Infantry Brigade and the 3rd Carpathian Rifles were ordered to press the attack, even as the scale of the losses became evident. They moved through the thick morning fog and the smoke of exploding shells. only to be met by the unrelenting steel storm delivered by the paratroopers' men, who fought with a tenacity born of pride and desperate belief in their defensive mission. The Polish infantry clawed their way up the slopes, gaining tenuous footholds only to be immediately counterattacked by explosive force or swift, localized charges. Platoons melted away, companies lost their command structure, and the entire advance stalled under the sheer weight of fire. The ground became so saturated with shrapnel and body fragments that it was said to resemble a field tilled by heavy iron plows. The relentless barrage meant that moving the wounded was a death sentence for the stretcher-bearers, forcing the survivors to choose between abandoning their fallen comrades or becoming casualties themselves. Simultaneously, the fighting intensified in the valley of the Albaneta farm. Albaneta was not merely a structure. It was a heavily fortified pocket that controlled the approach route toward the Colle Sant'Angelo Ridge. It consisted of a network of stone walls, communication trenches, machine gun bunkers dug deep into the rock, and vast, dense fields of anti-personnel wire. Capturing Albaneta meant wading through a labyrinth designed for sustained, close-quarters slaughter. The 4th Wallen Infantry Brigade attacked the farm defenses repeatedly throughout the day of the 12th. They drove forward with bayonets and grenades, luring point-blank fire from the deeply entrenched Germans. One company managed to penetrate the outer perimeter, reaching the main courtyard of the ruined farm, only to find themselves completely isolated, surrounded by fortified nests and subject to mortar fire that pulverized the remaining stone structures into dust. They fought there until every man was either killed, captured, or forced into a desperate, bloody retreat. General Władysław Anders, observing the reports of irreplaceable losses and the lack of any significant territorial gain, faced the agonizing decision no commander wishes to make. The sacrifices of the 11th and 12th had achieved their strategic goal of drawing the German reserves, but militarily, the line held firm against them. To continue the assault into the identical killing zone was not courage, it was self-immolation. On the evening of May 12th, Anders ordered the attack halted. The battle for the Polish sector paused, giving the surviving troops a brief, harrowing respite. It was not a surrender of purpose, but a necessary acknowledgement of tactical reality. They had failed to take the monastery in one sweep, but they had decimated their own ranks, ensuring that the wider Allied offensive Operation Diadem had found its necessary purchase elsewhere on the line. The days that followed were defined by a profound, terrible silence, broken only by the continuous shriek of Allied artillery supporting the wider front. For the exhausted Polish soldiers clinging to the exposed, corpse-strewn slopes, this pause was worse than the fighting itself. It was a period of dreadful contemplation, forcing them to live cheek by jowl with the bodies of their frizz, knowing that their task was not yet done. They were the shocked troops of the Exile, and though they had been broken against the rock, they had not been permitted to break their terrible contract. They were waiting for the inevitable order to re-enter the meat grinder, armed with the knowledge that the cost of vindication would be paid in the same currency, blood and rock. The fate of the battle, and indeed the entire Polish contribution to the war, now rested on whether they could rally one last time to storm the impregnable heights that had already consumed so many of their countrymen. This was more than a battle. It was the final, desperate testament of a nation that history had tried to erase, asserting its existence through the willingness to endure the unendurable agony of war. May 17, 1944, 2:30 p.m. High on the slopes of Monte Cassino, the thin line of Polish defense was stretched to the breaking point, brittle as aged glass. The Germans had absorbed the shock of the initial Polish surge, recognizing instantly that if the exiled soldiers consolidated their hold on the vital Phantom Ridge and Massif sector, the entire defensive structure anchored by the monastery would crumble. They launched a savage counterattack, calculated for maximum psychological impact and brute force. This was not a probing action. It was a furious, professional effort by the 1st Parachute Division aimed at erasing the Polish presence before twilight. The advance was preceded by a terrifying concentration of mortar and artillery fire, a storm that seemed designed not merely to kill, but to liquefy the rock itself. Shrapnel screamed across the open ground, tearing apart supply lines and pulverizing the shallow foxholes that the Polish infantry had managed to carve out of the shale. Polish troops, veterans of the unforgiving lands of the Middle East and the brutal Soviet gulags, had never encountered shelling of this focused, murderous intensity. It was an industrial slaughter that tested every ounce of their hard-won discipline. The German paratroopers, the Green Devils, moved with clinical efficiency, exploiting the temporary confusion wrought by the bombardment. They struck the junction between the 5th Kresowa Division and the 3rd Carpathian Division, the weakest point where the terrain was most fractured. They came not in great waves, but in tightly organized skirmishing groups, relying on machine guns and grenades, utilizing the cover of the terrain they knew intimately. Their goal was simple: push the Poles back into the valley, reclaim the height, and demonstrate that the monastery was ultimately inviolable. For the Polish soldiers, fighting on this ridge was a deeply personal ordeal. They were exhausted, parched, and surrounded by the bodies of their comrades, but within that horror something unbreakable ignited. Every man understood that retreat here did not just mean a tactical failure. It meant the erasure of their credibility, the silencing of their claim to represent a free nation. To fall back now was to confirm the Soviet and Western narrative that they were merely impenetrable auxiliaries, non-commissioned officers, many of them men hardened by years of exile and political imprisonment, rallied their platoons through sheer force of will. A corporal from the Carpathian Division, seeing his machine gun crew wiped out, dragged the heavy weapon into a shell crater himself, managing to unleash sustained fire into the advancing German ranks until his barrel glowed cherry red. He fought not with the professional stoicism of the British or American forces, but with the visceral rage of a man who had nothing left to lose but his honor. The German advance crested a low rise, and the two forces met in a savage, grenade-tossing melee. The distance quickly collapsed from yards to feet. Bayonets were fixed and rifles became clubs. The noise was overwhelming. The staccato rattle of the German MG-42s competing with the shouts of orders in Polish, the dull crump of exploding ordnance, and the screams of the wounded. This was the moment of maximum danger. A breakthrough here would have isolated the forward positions, turning the limited gains into a complete catastrophe. But the Polish line held. They had survived starvation in Siberia. They had endured the brutal heat of the Iranian desert. They had trained for years for this one moment. Their discipline, forged in the hardest school imaginable, proved superior to the exhausted German momentum. The Poles drew back the German stormtroopers with an unnerving, stubborn ferocity. Losses were catastrophic on both sides, but the Germans, running out of momentum and sensing the fixed, unwavering determination opposing them, began to falter. The counterattack finally stalled, less than 50 yards from the main Polish defensive line. It collapsed, not with a rout, but with a weary, painful withdrawal. The surviving German paratroopers dragging their wounded back down the treacherous slopes, leaving behind a new carpet of dead amongst the rock and the shattered olive trees. The repulse of that counterattack was the true victory of May 17th. It secured the high ground, stabilizing the front and proving that the Poles, though numerically small and politically compromised, possessed a fighting spirit that could not be broken. The monastery itself was now doomed, effectively encircled by the tenacious pressure exerted by the Polish Thai Corps. When the sun finally began to dip below the Liri Valley, casting long, bruised shadows over the carnage, a profound silence descended upon the mountain. It was a silence heavier than the earlier barrage, broken only by the whimpers of the injured and the guttural prayers of the survivors. They had held the line. They had paid the required tribute of blood. ensuring that the final, glorious seizure of the heights would be theirs alone. The symbolic weight of that repulse transcended the immediate tactical gain. It was a statement broadcast to Tehran, to London, and most importantly to Warsaw. The Polish nation still existed vibrant and resolute, carved into the stone of Monte Cassino by the sheer unyielding courage of its exiled sons. They had fought not just for a hill, but for the right to be remembered, establishing a monument of sacrifice more enduring than the Abbey itself, proving that while mapmakers might erase a country, they could never erase its soul. May 17, 1944, 11:30 p.m., near Albanetta Farm, the slopes of Monte Cassino. Below the towering silhouette of the Abbey, the Polish staging corps was breaking. They had borne the brunt of two massive assaults, Operation Honesty I and II, and the landscape was littered with the evidence of their terrible cost. The casualty rate among the infantry companies approached 70%. Entire battalions were reduced to skeletal formations led by exhausted non-commissioned officers. Yet, somewhere high above, the German paratroopers of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division were equally, though less visibly, shattered. The Defers had held the line for months against repeated Allied assaults, but the continuous artillery bombardment and the relentless Polish pressure had finally cracked the resilience of their human shield. General Władysław Anders, observing the carnage from his forward command post, faced the ultimate moral dilemma. Every further attack would be suicidal, yet withdrawing now meant confirming the belief held by certain Allied commanders that the Poles were simply incapable of taking the objective, reinforcing the political marginalization Poland faced at Tehran. He decided on a probing action, not a renewed corps-level assault, but a desperate test of the enemy's breaking point, a final, lethal flick of the wrist. The task fell to a handful of disparate, mixed units, most notably elements of the 12th Podolian Uhlans Regiment and the 3rd Carpathian Rifles Division. These men were selected not for their freshness. There was no fresh reserve left but for their sheer, obstinate survival. They were not a powerful wave. They were drops of water finding a hairline fracture in the dam. The final thrust was ordered for the first moments of May 18th. The terrain they faced was a moonscape of pulverized rock, exposed and devoid of cover. They had to cross open ground already saturated with the blood of their comrades, ground the Germans knew intimately and had zeroed perfectly. They moved in silence, the only sound the scraping of boots on shale and the choked breathing of men running on empty reserves. Thirst was their constant companion. A burning, paralyzing distraction more immediate than the distant threat of German machine gun fire, which had mercifully begun to slacken. The orders were simple, impossibly so. Probe the western slope, secure the area around Point 593, the infamous Phantom Ridge, and gain direct access to the monastery walls, moving through areas previously deemed impenetrable. Lieutenant Gwydion Chalmel of the Uhlans led his platoon forward. They were perhaps 30 men strong, a mix of young conscripts and battle-hardened veterans of the Russian front, bound together by the common memory of exile and the burning desire to see their national honor restored. As the sun began to paint the sky in hues of gray and blood orange, casting long, stark shadows over the shattered summit, an eerie stillness descended. It was a silence unlike any they had experienced on that mountain. Not the momentary lull before a counterattack, but a profound, unnatural vacuum. For weeks, the air had been a screaming cacophony of incoming and outgoing fire. Now, only the distant, ragged sounds of skirmishing far down the slope disturbed the peace. Miel's platoon, moving cautiously around a huge crater near the western wall, hesitated. Every instinct told them this was a trap, that the silence was a calculated lure designed to pull them into a final, murderous curtain of fire. But they pushed on, fueled by the knowledge that they had nothing left to lose. They scrambled over the remaining outer defenses, which were nothing more than jumbles of loose stones, moving with a desperate animal stealth toward the ruined skeletal arches of the Abbey itself. What they found inside was not a defiant German garrison ready for a final hand-to-hand fight. They found desolation. The great monastic complex was a smoking hollow shell. The defers were gone. Exhausted, out of ammunition, and finally unsupported, the remnants of the 1st Parachute Division had slipped away during the night, moving south toward the new defense line, the Doria Line. They had been fighting until the very last shell, but the human machine had simply run out of fuel. The Polish soldiers entered the ruins. They moved through shattered courtyards and collapsed cloisters, stepping around unexploded ordnance and the bodies of the last stubborn defers. The tactical objective that had consumed the lives of thousands of Allied soldiers was now theirs, taken not by a grand decisive charge, but by the stubborn last-gasp effort of a small, isolated platoon who had simply refused to stop climbing. It was a corporal, Emil Czech, a signals operator who produced a makeshift flag. It was a simple, small banner, white and red, perhaps cobbled together from medical cloth and dye. He climbed onto the highest pile of rubble, the remnant of the monastery's tower, and tied the Polish colors to a length of iron reinforcing bar. As the flag snapped taut in the morning breeze, visible for miles across the Liri Valley, the world knew that the fortress of Monte Cassino had finally fallen. The moment was one of staggering paradox. The tactical victory was complete, yet the men on the summit felt little jubilation. They were too tired, too close to the ghosts of the 10,000 casualties that paved the road to the Abbey. They had proved their military prowess beyond any doubt, paying the highest possible currency for the right to stand shoulder to shoulder with the Allies. Yet, even as the Polish flag flew over the most famous position on the Western Front, the future of the nation it represented was already being decided in the cynical chambers of Moscow and Yalta. This magnificent sacrifice would not purchase Poland's freedom. It would merely secure its memory. The sound that followed the flag raising was perhaps the most poignant moment of the entire war. A single Polish butler, Sergeant Kazimierz Szmiel, standing amidst the desolation, raising his battered instrument and playing the ancient Pia, melancholic call of the Hejno Mariaki, the traditional anthem of Krakow. The notes rang out across the valley, a sound of defiance and sorrow combined, a profound statement of national honor accomplished at the exact moment of national betrayal. The silence that answered that lone bugle call was the most expensive silence of the 20th century. A terrible reminder that sometimes fighting for the right to exist is the only victory a nation can truly claim. May 18, 1944, 4:30 a.m., on the scarred ridge below the monastery of Monte Cassino, the final, brutal charge of the Polish II Corps was underway. This was not a massive, coordinated sweep, but a desperate scramble by exhausted men who knew this was the last possible moment. The 12th Podolian Lancers and elements of the 1st Battalion of the 2nd Brigade, having fought for 48 consecutive hours without meaningful rest, exploited the narrow, almost vertical breach created by the earlier, suicidal diversionary attacks. They moved through trenches named after the Polish cities they could no longer return to: Lwów, Wilno, Krakow. The German defers the remnants of the 1st Parachute Division were perhaps the finest light infantry soldiers the war had produced, but they were now decimated, isolated, and running low on ammunition. Yet their professionalism held. They did not retreat. They merely died in place. The initial success came through the sheer impossibility of the terrain. The Poles pushed forward into the ruins, not as a fighting formation, but as a chain of individual duels. The monastery, reduced to a choking landscape of pulverized marble and reinforcing iron, offered thousands of small defensive nests. The Fallschirmjäger had tunneled into the debris, creating bunkers protected by tons of ancient stone. To defeat them required clearing these holes one by one, using grenades, flamethrowers, and fixed bayonets. The combat inside the perimeter was intimate, terrifying, and silent, drowned out by the constant, dull roar of artillery hammering the surrounding slopes. Men tripped over detached heads and limbs, struggling to keep their balance on slopes slick with dew and blood. Vision was limited to 10 or 15 feet, obscured by the continuous fine dust that coated lungs and rifles alike, turning uniforms the uniform gray of the ruins themselves. The only sound that mattered was the metallic clatter of the breech bolt being drawn back, followed by the muffled thump of a grenade rolling into a cellar. In one crucial action, a squad of the Podolian Lancers discovered the main cistern, which had been converted into a German command post and aid station. They were trapped above it for an hour, exchanging fire with invisible enemies below, until Lieutenant Roman Kaczmarzyk led a charge, dropping into the dark, wet opening. What followed was a melee fought with entrenching tools and pistol butts. The fight lasted less than 3 minutes, but it eliminated the last cohesive center of organized resistance on the summit proper. By 8:00 the Poles knew they had won, though they could not see the enemy surer. They only saw the lack of return fire. Scattered German survivors, unable to evacuate their wounded and lacking any coherent orders, began to emerge, blinking, hands raised, from the wreckage. These were not the confident paratroopers of the previous week. They were shattered men, many weeping from exhaustion and shock. They were offered water and cigarettes, the grim, shared humanity of the front lines prevailing over national hatreds in the final moments of the bloodiest battle. It was during the systematic clearing that Lieutenant Gerbiel's patrol found the exhausted lone soldier who had done so much to fix the German line 2 days earlier, a machine gunner who had held a critical forward pillbox with only a handful of men until he collapsed from heat stroke and loss of blood. He was alive, barely, cradling his jammed weapon, surrounded by empty casings. His survival was as miraculous as the victory itself. As the sun climbed higher, bathing the ruined plateau in harsh morning light, the Poles gathered. There was no great triumphal procession, no mass cheering. There was only a profound sense of emptiness. After 4 months of ceaseless bombardment, the silence was palpable, almost painful. It was the sound of millions of rounds of ammunition having been spent. The silence bought by 4,000 Polish casualties. Colonel Władysław Bobrowski, surveying the scene, ordered the national standards brought forward. The official Polish army flag was heavy, rich red and white silk, normally reserved for ceremonies, but the first thing to be planted was simpler: the square scarlet and white pennant of the 12th Podolian Lancers, affixed to a splintered communications pole. Corporal Emil Czech, a trumpeter, was then handed the heavy brass bugle. He climbed onto the highest pile of rubble, the remnants of the monastery's western wall, and began to play. The sound that followed the Hymnał Mariacki was not merely a celebration of tactical success. It was the proclamation that Polish arms had retained their honor despite exile, that Polish loyalty to the Allied cause was unblemished. It was a sound that reached across the whole of Europe, asserting the spiritual and national existence of a country already being carved up by cynical diplomacy thousands of miles away. The soldiers, standing ankle-deep in the pulverized history of 1,000 years, understood the implications without needing to read a political dispatch. They had fought for their flag, for their right to return home, and for the integrity of their nation's commitment. And in that moment, as the final notes faded over the Liri Valley, they had secured the moral high ground. Monte Cassino was not merely a military victory. It was a national referendum, cast in blood and stone, testifying that while borders might be erased by politics, the Polish will to fight for freedom could never be extinguished. Their loyalty to the Allied cause had cost them everything: their homes, their future stability, and the lives of thousands of their comrades. But in return, they earned an enduring, ironclad moral standing that no treaty could ever take away. The stone crest of the mountain, now flying the colors of a nation that existed only on maps and battlefields, became a permanent silent monument to that costly integrity. The place where the honor of the Polish exile armies finally found its vindication. May 18, 1944, just after 10 a.m. At the summit of Monte Cassino, the fighting stopped, not with a formal declaration, but with a sudden, dreadful, and total absence of sound. The final assault wave, men of the 3rd Carpathian Division, had surged through the last breaches in the walls, meeting little organized resistance. The handful of remaining German paratroopers, the vaunted Fallschirmjäger, were spent. They had resisted for 4 months, through bombing campaigns that reduced the Abbey to dust and through repeated bloody Allied offensives. Now they were either dead, wounded, or too physically and mentally shattered to fight another minute. They emerged from the subterranean ruins with their hands raised, blinking in the thin mountain air, serving their impossible stronghold to men who had nothing left to lose but their honor. The first physical act of total capture was the raising of the flag. Signalman Władysław Gwyn Ulden and Corporal Emil Czech were among the very first to reach the highest visible pile of pulverized rubble that had once been the sanctuary's apse. There was no flagpole, only jagged, broken stone. Corporal Czech secured a simple white and red banner, the flag of the Republic of Poland, to a piece of rebar and drove it into the highest point of the ruin. This small patch of cloth, stark against the smoke-stained sky, became the only visible declaration that the seemingly impregnable German defensive line, the Gustav Line, had been broken by men fighting for a nation that technically no longer existed. The silence that followed was not the triumphant cheer of victory, but the crushing, reverberating stillness of total exhaustion. For 5 agonizing days, the Polish the 10 Corps had attacked uphill against relentless mortar and machine gun fire. Before that, they had trained in the heat of the Middle East and fought across the plains of Africa. For years, they had lived the rootless existence of the Exile army. Now, they simply collapsed. They did not celebrate. They sat down among the dead their own. The British, the Indians, the French, the Americans, and the Germans, and waited for their breathing to regulate. The summit was an inversion of nature. It was a landscape engineered by high explosives, a moonscape of chalky white powder, splintered timbers, and the sickening scent of cordite mixed with blood. Nothing recognizable remained of the ancient monastery save for the lowest foundations and the crypts. The men who took it were themselves ruins' faces, coated in dust and sweat, eyes hollowed out by fear and fatigue, uniforms ripped and stained. They were not heroes in the sense of Hollywood scripts. They were profoundly ordinary men who had been pushed past the limits of human endurance, driven only by the knowledge that this specific piece of ground was their only coin of credibility in the eyes of the free world. Then, breaking the oppressive silence, came the sound that traveled across the entire Liri Valley. Signalman Gui Inju, still clutching his trumpet, stood amidst the wreckage. He raised the brass instrument and played the Henio Mariachi, the traditional 5-note trumpet call of Krakow. This call, normally played every hour from the Tower of St. No, Mary's Basilica back in the city they could not return to, drifted out over the battlefield. It was a mournful, defiant, and strangely beautiful sound. It signaled victory, yes, but more deeply, it confirmed survival. Down in the valley, Allied troops, British, Canadian, and American, who had watched this monumental struggle for months, hearing the incessant, brutal artillery exchange, suddenly understood. They saw the flag, they heard the lonely, pure sound of the trumpet call, and they knew the mountain was finally cleared. Soon after, the II Corps was relieved, and the 13th London Rifles advanced through the ruins to secure the position while the Polish soldiers began the slow, painful descent. They left behind 923 dead comrades interred on the slopes below the Abbey, sacrifice far exceeding the numbers lost by any other single national unit during the 4 battles of Cassino. They had paid the highest price for a strategic objective that opened the door to Rome, an objective that would benefit the greater Allied war machine. Yet, as the exhausted troops marched away from the mountain, they carried with them an invisible and profound burden, the dawning realization of their political isolation. Weeks later, as the Allies liberated Rome, the grand strategy was shifting in ways that sealed Poland's post-war fate. Even as the Polish soldiers were being lauded for their unimaginable bravery in Italy, the great powers were deciding Poland's future not in Warsaw or London, but in Moscow and Tehran. The victory at Monte Cassino, while proving their incomparable fighting spirit, did not buy them political sovereignty. It only established a moral claim that history would later ignore. The mountain became the most powerful testimony to their loyalty. The graves that grew upon the slope were not just final resting places. They were concrete evidence that the Polish nation, even when exiled, beaten, and seemingly abandoned, upheld its commitment to freedom and fought against tyranny until the very last shell was fired. That honor, forged in the dust and death of the monastery ruins, became the true, enduring possession of the Polish 13th Corps. They could not restore their nation's freedom, but they had definitively rescued its soul. The stone crest of Monte Cassino stands eternal, a silent white monument to the cost of fidelity, proving that sometimes the greatest military victory is simply the preservation of unblemished moral integrity. May 19, 1944, the headquarters of the British 8th Army, Central Italy. The immediate reaction to the capture of the supposedly impregnable bastion was one of overwhelming relief and deep admiration. Telegrams of congratulation poured in from Allied commands across the globe, recognizing the singular brutality of the battle and the tenacity required to seize the monastery heights. Field Marshal Harold Alexander himself, the commander-in-chief of the Allied armies in Italy, issued a general order specifically citing the Polish II Corps. He wrote that the victory had vindicated the faith placed in them, and that the sacrifice proved once again the magnificent fighting qualities of the Polish soldier. For General Anders and the men of the II Corps, these words were desperately needed balm on the fresh wounds of war. Monte Cassino was more than a strategic crossroads. It was the crucible where their legitimacy, questioned since their arrival in the West, was forged anew. They had proven, beyond any doubt, their absolute commitment to the Allied cause, achieving what veteran British, American, French, and New Zealand units had failed to do over 4 long months. They had paid for their moral credibility with over 4,000 casualties, but they had purchased something invaluable, the indisputable proof that the Polish nation, though subjugated and exiled, stood eternally among the free peoples resisting tyranny. This symbolic vindication, however, occurred under the lengthening shadow of political reality that refused to acknowledge military sacrifice. As the Polish flags waved defiantly over the ruined abbey, the geopolitical landscape was being irrevocably redrawn hundreds of miles away, and the destiny of Poland was being determined not by the courage of its soldiers, but by the convenience of its Western allies. While the Poles were demonstrating fidelity in Italy, the great powers, Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, were already confirming the contours of post-war Europe laid down at Tehran and soon to be formalized at Yalta. The cruel paradox of Monte Cassino was this: the Polish soldiers had fought explicitly to earn their place at the table of victors, yet the table itself was shrinking, and their seat was already ceded. The news filtering down the lines in the late summer and autumn of 1944 was devastating. The Polish government in exile in London, the legitimate body for which the soldiers fought, was systematically being sidelined. The Western Allies prioritizing the maintenance of the Grand Alliance with Stalin's Soviet Union and focusing on the massive imping operations in Normandy were unwilling to risk a diplomatic rift over Poland's sovereignty or its eastern borders, which had already been seized by the Red Army. General Anders, acutely aware of the political machinations, watched in anguish as the very allies he bled for prepared to abandon his nation to the domination of Stalin, whose forces were now recognized as the effective liberators of Eastern Europe. The soldiers who had endured the Siberian gulags, who had traversed deserts, and who had finally scaled the sheer face of Monte Cassino realized with chilling clarity that their victory had not saved their homeland. It had only ensured that they, as individuals, had kept their honor intact. The full weight of this betrayal settled upon the Takan Corps as the war progressed. The Warsaw Uprising, launched by the Polish Home Army in August 1944, received only token and ultimately ineffectual assistance from the Western Allies, while Soviet forces waited cynically on the Vistula's eastern bank. The message was clear. Polish independence was secondary to Soviet strategic goals. When the Yalta Conference concluded in February 1945, cementing the establishment of a Soviet-backed provisional government in Warsaw and confirming the massive eastward shift of Polish borders, the political fate of the Polish Takan Corps was sealed. They were not returning home as heroes to a free nation. They were victors without a country. Their ultimate military triumphs, the liberation of Ancona, the pursuit of the Germans into the Gothic Line, and the liberation of Bologna in April 1945, were fought with the bitter knowledge that they were fighting for the freedom of others, having lost their own. The choice facing the tens of thousands of soldiers in the TT Corps, many of whom had fought since 1939, was stark and excruciating. They could return to a Soviet-controlled Poland, where their service under the Western Command, and especially their origins in the anti-communist Anders Army, would mark them instantly as traitors and enemies of the state. Or they could accept a permanent life of exile, strangers in the Western countries they had helped to save. For many, the return was unthinkable. To face imprisonment, persecution, or execution by the new regime was a fate worse than continued exile. They were forced to watch as their legitimate government was disavowed and the memory of their wartime sacrifices was systematically suppressed in their homeland by communist propaganda, which deliberately erased the role of Anders' army in the Italian campaign. Monte Cassino, the pinnacle of their achievement, became a forbidden story, a secret testament passed down in whispers among the truly faithful. Yet the legacy of that monumental struggle transcended political boundaries. The Polish eagle raised over the monastery ruins on May 18, 1944, remained a defiant symbol of fidelity and resistance. It served as a spiritual anchor for the millions who endured 4 decades behind the Iron Curtain, a constant reminder that Polish identity, Polish courage, and the pursuit of true freedom had been validated not by treaties or political expediency, but by bloodshed on foreign soil. The men of the two corps, the unwilling exiles, had achieved the greatest possible victory. They had secured their honor, ensuring that the history of their nation's struggle for freedom would not be written solely by the victors of Yalta, but by the soldiers who died, proving that moral integrity, even in defeat, can outshine the most dazzling political triumph. That mountainous battlefield in Italy became the unmovable foundation upon which the memory of a free Poland was preserved during its darkest hours, ready to inspire the renewal of the nation when the dawn finally broke decades later. January 29, 1945, 2 p.m. at the Polish War Cemetery, Monte Cassino. The dawn that those exiled soldiers waited for was a long time coming, purchased at a price few nations in history have ever been asked to pay. For the men of the 20 Corps, the victory was overwhelming. Yet the cost was measured not only in the thousands of crosses planted beneath the mountain marking the grave of Poland's finest sons, but in the crushing, existential realization that as they raised the Polish flag over the rubble of the Abbey, the decisions made in distant conference rooms had already condemned their homeland to another form of occupation. The irony is monumental, cold, and unforgiving. These Polish forces, who had escaped Siberian gulags and traversed continents, proved themselves to be among the most formidable fighting units in the Allied arsenal. They broke Hitler's seemingly unbreakable line. They vindicated the entire purpose of their nation's struggle. Yet they won freedom for others only to lose their own. Monte Cassino ensured that the Polish contribution could never be dismissed, but it simultaneously cemented their tragic destiny as unwilling exiles, barred from the liberated Europe they helped create. They became the living, breathing symbols of Western betrayal. They fought for the universal ideal of freedom, only to be cast into the political purgatory of men without a nation, told they could not return home without risking immediate arrest or execution by the new Soviet-backed regime. The mountain they captured was the only soil on which they could truly stand free, a perpetual, solemn memorial that declared, in stone and blood, that Poland had never served, even when the Allies served Poland to communism. Their legacy trans military history. It is a powerful testament to the principle that victory is sometimes defined not by political outcome, but by moral integrity and the absolute refusal to be dehumanized by circumstance. The capture of the monastery was their final act of defiance against a history that sought to erase them. It ensured that behind the Iron Curtain, generations of oppressed Poles knew, absolutely, that the spirit of their nation still stood unbroken, etched high on a mountain in Italy. The stones of that conquered abbey, scattered by explosive fury, became the unmovable foundation for the renewal of Polish identity throughout the long Cold War night. It is the ultimate paradox of the Second World War, the most necessary victory for Polish honor, purchased through the deepest political betrayal. Monte Cassino stands not merely as a military cemetery, but as a perpetual reminder that heroism is often rewarded not with peace or homecoming, but with the profound, lonely dignity of having done what was right when the world turned away. Their immense sacrifice guarantees that the memory of free Poland could not be extinguished, only delayed, waiting until the final, distant dawn broke over Warsaw decades later.